I'm Jennifer. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is January 12th of 1992. I have a sponsor. Her name is Debbie, and I have a home group. It's the Midtown group. We meet in Wilmington on Mondays and Thursdays at 7 p.m. We'd love to have you if you're ever there. I always start my talk out with those three things because I don't believe I'd be a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous if I didn't have those things. They're a vital reason as to why I've gotten to stay here, I believe. Thank you for asking me to speak. You know, one of the things I love in AA that we do is that we celebrate, and we celebrate our recovery, we celebrate how long our group's been around, and those celebrations to me are really important. So it's really an honor to be asked to share on David's anniversary. So thanks for having me. It's always good to be asked to come back as well, you know. Prior to Alcoholics Anonymous, nobody really wanted me around the way that I acted. So to keep getting asked back is a privilege. I'm going to share with you in a general way what I was like, what happened, and what I'm like today. And, you know, I'm not the face of Alcoholics Anonymous. All I have is my experience, strength, and hope. And so if you're here and you're new, you know, what I was told when I got here was to try to find the things, the similarities, and to not identify myself out. Because the one thing I did not want to be was in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I mean, that was the last place I wanted to be. I didn't want to identify with you people because then maybe I might have to keep coming back to these things. You know, but it was important for me that when I came to these meetings and when the old-timers would talk about how they felt, and they talked about that fear and the hopelessness, those were the things that I identified with. Because when I got here, I didn't look like you people. I got to Alcoholics Anonymous really young. And the meeting that I landed in, there weren't any young people there. It was all, you know, like guys as old as, you know, dirt and had been sober since God, you know. Like, that's the kind of group that I landed in, and I didn't have anything in common with them on the exterior. But the thing is that I kept coming back, and I just listened to what they said because I was desperate. My parents divorced when I was really young. I was about 3, so I don't ever remember them being together. And I went and lived with my father. There was a big battle for the kids, but the battle was really between the two of them, you know. My dad wasn't ever around, and when we went and lived with my father, he had already remarried. And he married, you know, the wicked stepmother. And, you know, what I'll say about that is that she had a lot of mental illness. I mean, she has a lot of mental illness. That hasn't changed. But, you know, I had to find a lot of understanding when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, especially in concerns to her, because there was a lot of abuse, a lot of just kind of crazy stuff that happened in that household. And I would have told you when I got here that that's the reason that I ended up here, you know, was because of everything that happened in my life I would have blamed on my dad, my stepmom, my mom not being there enough, you know. Prior to getting here, that's what I always said was, you don't understand. You don't understand. If I had a nickel for every time I said you don't understand. But the good thing is that alcohol beat me into this place of submission that I wasn't blaming. You know, I finally got to a place that I wasn't blaming. And I knew I was just kind of a worthless human being by the time I got here. But nonetheless, it was really abusive. It was really crazy. I could not stand myself from a really early age. I mean, I look at myself now, like, as an adult, and I see pictures of myself, and I'm like, oh, I was a cute little kid, you know? Like, but that is not what it felt like. I felt completely uncomfortable. I hated my red hair. I used to wrap my little fingers around it and rip it out. And so I was just restless, irritable, and discontent really from the very beginning. And I didn't feel like I fit in when I went to school. I have an older brother. He's 1 year older than me. And I ran around with him. I just kind of tagged along, and I was a tomboy. And, you know, he was really, they kind of always treated me like a little boy, you know. And so I kind of just lost my identity a lot in that. And I would see, like, my mom, and my mom was never around, but she was who I wanted to be, and she was who I wanted to be with, and she was this beautiful, like, little petite blonde, and I wanted to be like her, you know. I wanted to dye my hair at, like, you know, 6. I was ready to bleach my hair out, and now the funny thing about that is, like, my hair's my thing now. If anybody tried to do anything with my hair, I'd hurt them. So, you know, but it's interesting, but I learned that stuff in Alcoholics Anonymous to, like, find the things that I love about myself, because I just didn't know how to do that before I got here. So I just was really uncomfortable. And then I would come home to this household that was crazy and insane. And I would watch the news, and they would have on TV these children that were abducted. And I would think, why can't somebody abduct me? I remember very clearly being like, I wish somebody would kidnap me, because no matter where I go, it can't be worse than where I'm at right now. And that was like the theme for me too, is no matter where I ever was, I wanted to be somewhere else. And it could be worse. It didn't matter. I just wanted to be somewhere else. So when we were 8, my brother and I decided that we were going to run away. And I don't know if that's a normal thing that 8-year-olds come up with. I look at my nephews now, and I can't imagine them deciding that they're going to run away. But we skipped the bus, and we called. My mom had married for a short period of time. She married this man. And so, that's the sucker, you know what I mean? You call the guy that knows nothing about nothing. And we skipped the bus, and we called him, and he came and picked us up, had no idea what to do with us. And we were just at that place, my dad wasn't around. He was drinking and partying, and this woman was the person who was supposed to be our caretaker, and she was really... her illness was she was just rapidly digressing. So my mom came and picked us up, and, for a 3 to 6 month time period, I got to live with my mom. That was the amount of time that I ever was with my mother. And, she was the person that when I was a little girl, I didn't know a lot about prayer. I didn't know a lot about church. I just wasn't raised that way. The one prayer that I was taught was now I lay me down to sleep. That's just a really scary prayer for a little kid, I pray that, the Lord my soul to take. That's just scary, And so that's really all I knew about prayer. And we didn't go to church a whole lot. But I do remember, when it was crazy in that household, I would just cry. And I would be like, I just want to be with my mom. Please just let me be with my mom. And so that's that little time period that we were with her. My mom's alcoholic, and she was alcoholic all during me growing up, and my mom could never make a choice to choose us, she always chose alcohol. She always chose the man. It didn't matter. It was, it was her disease, and so we were there for a short period of time, and during that short period of time is when I had my first drink. It was with my mom. She'd gotten in a fight with a guy, and she threw me in the car, and my job was always to cheer mom up. I was the adult, and she was the child almost, and my job was to make her feel better. And so she threw me in the car, and we went riding around, and she pulled over, and she got a 6-pack, and she handed me a beer. Now, what I remember about that is my mom she had been a bartender and a manager of this, nasty Irish pub. It was, your feet would stick to it when you walked. It was gross. It smelled like urine, That was my favorite place to go when I was a kid. If you asked me, where do you want to go? Bentley's. That's where I wanted to be. And so I knew that what happened in there was that people drank. I knew that was kind of the thing. And I wanted to be a waitress when I grew up. That was my vision. And so when she handed me that beer, I was stoked, I was holding it up. I was like a little kid. My head barely came over the window, but I was holding that up because I wanted everybody to know, I've arrived, I'm an adult now. And again, it goes back to that. I always wanted to be somewhere that I wasn't, and I always wanted to be older. I always wanted to be, hanging out with the cool people or whatever. And my mom was this party girl, and I wanted to be like that, And I never felt like that inside. And so, I wasn't a daily drinker at 8 or anything, but for me it was somewhere in my head it clicked, I'm grown now. And I stopped listening to direction. We went and lived with my grandparents because my mom just really wasn't capable of taking care of us. And my grandparents were the coolest people I ever known. My granddaddy lived his life the principles that were taught in here. It was just a natural thing for him. And my grandma was the same way. She was the most naive woman you'd ever meet. So that was fantastic for me and my brother because we could tell her, no, we didn't do that, and she'd really think that we hadn't done it. She never would have thought that the things that we were doing were going on in that household. And so, it was a perfect environment. And all of these things that I share, I don't share them because that's the reason that I'm alcoholic. I share them because it lets you know, I was primed and ready for a drink. So when I had my first drunk, I was ready to go. And that was when I was 10, and we found a bottle of whiskey, and we went upstairs, and we just inherently knew how to play quarters, and off we went. And I remember everything about that night, the way that it felt when that whiskey hit the bottom of my stomach, and I felt like I could breathe for the first time. It was like warmth. It burned the heck out of the back of my throat, but when it hit my stomach, that warmth that went all over me just made me feel okay, and I was at peace and ease. And the funny thing is, my brother had his friend over, and I had a crush on his friend. And of course, like, I'm weird, I'm awkward, I have this curly red hair, and, I just feel like a weirdo anyway. And so his friend was over, and so, I wanted to be impressive or whatever. And so off we go, and we're doing these shots. And, in a very short period of time, I'm hammered. And I remember laying there in the room just spinning. And I was just like, this is the best moment of my life. Because my brother was over there yelling at me, because I'm sure I was being loud and obnoxious. And he was yelling these horrific things that he would normally say to me on a normal day. Like, he would call me really bad names, and it would, like, hurt my heart. And that night, it did not hurt my heart. It was like, wah, 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 like, it did not affect me. And that's the magic that alcohol did for me. And that's what I sought after. And that boy that I had a crush on, I punched him and knocked him down the stairs. I didn't need him anymore, I was good. And, they dared me $20. I couldn't finish that bottle of whiskey, and I threw it back, My experiences is from the first drunk that I have. I've never picked up alcohol and it not been a drunk. That's just the way that I go. I have 2 speeds. It's called stop and fast, and there is absolutely nothing in between for me. And anybody who knows me really well, they know that's true about me, including driving the car. So I then proceeded to leave my DNA all over the house. My grandmother had no clue what was wrong. I was standing at the top of the stairs, and she was like, well, if you're sick, come downstairs, and I just, like, threw up, and then I rolled down the stairs, and then she helped me up. I had just drank straight whiskey. She was clueless, and she helped me in the bathroom, and I remember thinking, keep it together, and I fell in the bathroom, or in the bathtub, and I peed myself, and then I vomited everywhere else, and I was vomiting blood. I became deathly ill, and I experienced my first blackout. What I do know that happened that night is that they called 2 places. They called Alcoholics Anonymous, which is kind of weird, and then they called my uncle, and my uncle was the cool guy with the Harley Davidson. He always had a beer in his hand. And they knew that he would know what to do with me, And I always talk about my uncle, and I always share what happened with my uncle at this point in my story, because I don't ever want to forget to talk about it. He was that guy that he was just super cool, and he would let us drink wine coolers later on when we were like 12 and 13, at the house, and he had a pool. And there were many times that I was suicidal during that time period, and he talked to me, and he sat me down and really tried to help me a lot. But he was afflicted with this thing called alcoholism, and when I was 6 months sober, I came home from school, and I was on the fence, y'all. I was coming to these meetings. I didn't look like you people, and I was doing the deal, and I knew that my life was getting better. But when it talks about, to our innermost self admitting that we're alcoholic, and in the first step of the 12 and 12, it says that if we do not believe this to be a life and death errand, we will not continue on the remaining 11 steps and do the work. And that's one thing that I've come to believe is very true for me, because what happened for me is that I came home from school, and that man and my aunt had a big fight, and he left, and she thought that he had checked himself into rehab because the phone book was opened up to rehabs. And she called all the rehabs, and she couldn't find him. And after a week, she sent people looking for him. And they found him behind her house. He had shot himself with a shotgun. And alcoholism had never been described more clearly for me. Is that I may not die of cirrhosis of the liver when I'm, 14, 15 years old. I may not get in a drunk driving car accident because I don't have a license. But what I do know is that my alcoholism took me to this place that it made complete sense for me to take my own life. And it seemed like the only right solution for me. And so he was a huge part of my story, because when that happened, something shifted inside of me, because I knew that if I were to pick up a drink again, it might not be that day, it might not be a week later, but I would get to that place and I would either take my own life, or, you know, like I would die. I knew that I would die of alcoholism. And so I always like to talk about that because I don't ever want to forget that, you know. I don't ever want to forget that we don't all make it. And when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I was told that some people die so that other people can stay sober. And I remember thinking that was a really mean thing to say. But it's the reality, and that there's a lot of fun to be had in Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, like I love AA, and I love joking around and being silly. And some of the things that we do, like we laugh at just some of these, you know, just horrible things, right? And we're able to laugh at those things. But the reality is that I suffer from this disease that is cunning, baffling, and powerful, and it will take me to this place that God never intended me to be, you know, because I don't know what your higher power is, but I don't think mine created me to destroy myself. And that's what proceeded to happen from that night on every time, because from that night when I was 10, I had a solution to my life. I had a solution to that emptiness and that loneliness that I felt inside, that awkwardness, the ability to talk to people. And I was painfully shy as a kid. And most people think like that I'm totally not a shy person. I really am. And AA has given me the ability to not you know, stay in that space. But naturally, I'm a really shy person. And I was so shy then. And alcohol gave me the ability to go amongst people and not care what you thought about me. Because when I was at school, everybody was making fun of me. I mean, I was in my head constantly as a kid. And I always felt just not good enough and not a part of. And alcohol gave me relief from that because it just made me not care. So, you know, my first rehab was when I was 13 years old. And what progressed up to that point, you know, I was sneaking out of the house every night, stealing money, you know, getting in trouble. I always hung out with older kids. I was always able to get everything that I needed to get. And I got to a place where I was a daily drinker. And there were some other substances that were involved at that time. And that's kind of what led to this rehab place. And I go to this rehab, and they put me in there in like the day treatment, you know, to start with. And literally like within 48 hours, they had me in the lockdown inpatient padded room. You know, they were like, we're not letting this one out. And so I end up in this treatment center. I was in there for about 6 months. Now, in between those 6 months, I kicked the window out. I ended up in downtown Oak Cliff in a house with no floor, bars on the window, with 2 guys in a stolen Jeep I'd never met before, you know. Because, like, that's just what it looks like for me. You know, I've got stop and I've got fast. And when I go fast, you know. And I knew when I was in Oak Cliff, I mean, anybody who's been to Dallas and knows the Oak Cliff area, you don't go to Oak Cliff. And I knew right away, like, I mean, I'm not a total idiot. I knew, like, I needed to get out of there. And so I called my 18-year-old boyfriend that I had at the time, which also my family was super excited about. You know, I was 13, he was 18. I called him to come get me.